Hello, my name is Karen Wilmshurst. I work for Autism Wessex. I'm Advocacy Services Manager, and I'm going to talk to you about autism awareness and understanding, particularly how football clubs can maybe help their fans and their employees and volunteers who may have the condition. Autism affects about 1 in 100 people, and it's not a mental health condition and it's not a learning disability. It's a neurodevelopmental disorder. And some people with autism may well have mental ill health issues and also learning disabilities. If you've heard the terms high functioning autism, classic autism, Asperger's syndrome, perhaps autism spectrum disorder or condition, they are all on the spectrum. So everybody with a diagnosis, those labels if you like, has gone through the same diagnostic process, and the differences and the difficulties that they face will be the same. It just means some people may have that in varying degrees. One thing that's really important to remember is that some people with autism will be non-verbal. They might not be able to talk at all or may have very limited speech. Other people might be very articulate. They might be able to speak freely, they might be able to engage with you very well, but often the difficulties with comprehension and interaction, are still there. So it's important not to make assumptions just because somebody may be articulate that they are understanding the full implications of their surroundings and the interaction you might have with them. Autism affects 4 areas. That includes flexible thinking, communication, interaction, and sensory processing. Flexible thinking affects a whole range of processing with somebody with autism. By that I mean we could be talking about envisaging consequences, planning, sequencing, organising, abstract thinking, so thinking about things that might not be in the concrete world. That's all involved in our flexible thinking. We have the ability, if you like, to predict things or envisage things that we might not have ever experienced. So, for example, if I was going to a football ground, I haven't been to a football match before. However, I can envisage what might happen and what facilities might be available. So, for example, if I have autism, I might see things in quite a different way. I might be leaving the house and thinking, what happens if there's not a toilet when I get there? I know when I'm nervous I need the toilet a lot. So actually maybe I'll go back and I'll just use the toilet again at home. Or actually maybe I'll work out where the toilets are en route because I might need to stop several times. What happens if there's no chairs for me to sit on? What happens if I get lost? I wouldn't know necessarily that there's somebody that I could ask to for help. What happens if I'm expected to do something that I'm really not comfortable with? What happens if I'm expected to stand up and sing songs from Mamma Mia, for example? It sounds totally irrational, but actually for somebody with autism, trying to understand what the experience might be can be really quite overwhelming. There might be things that come into their imagination that seem so completely random, so offbeat. Why would somebody even think about that? But if I haven't got that flexible thinking, if I haven't got that understanding of realistically what might happen or what I can expect, I might be imagining all sorts of things. So before I've even left the house, in the build up to anything, often my anxiety levels are really, really high, and it might prevent me from leaving the house or doing what it is that's asked of me. Another area of difference with autism is really quite a common one, where people often talk about the communication differences with somebody with autism. So you might hear the phrases of people with autism don't make eye contact, people with autism don't like to be touched, all of those sorts of things. It's not quite as simple as that, as you can imagine. Everybody with autism is different. And their diagnosis, their condition will present in different ways. So, for example, if we talk about spatial awareness, as I said, people might say people with autism don't like to be touched. As you're probably aware, we're all born with our bubble. If people invade our space, if they get too close, we might feel uncomfortable. If they're too far away, again, it makes us maybe feel a bit sort of disconnected. That bubble, if you like, is something that we don't get taught. We don't learn about at spatial awareness classes. It's just something that's there. And somebody with autism often will find that actually their bubble isn't quite the same. So they might come quite close to somebody, they might stay further away. They might not have the same processing as we do. So if you imagine being at a football match with lots of crowds, perhaps queues, things like that, it might feel extremely uncomfortable. Sometimes people say it's painful. One gentleman described it as being in a queue is like having thousands of spiders crawling all over him. And if that's happening just while you're queuing to get through a turnstile or queuing for a ticket or standing next to somebody at the match, that can be incredibly difficult. Again, I don't go to eye contact classes when I'm young. Somehow we have these unwritten social rules about appropriate eye contact, and somebody with autism might find that quite difficult for a number of reasons. One, it might not come naturally. So some people say I'm often accused of staring at people, or I'm often accused of not paying attention when I'm looking away. It's often that I just find it difficult to make that what we class as appropriate eye contact. It could also be that somebody finds it quite difficult whilst they're trying to make eye contact, they're trying to engage with that person in the way that we would want them to. It can be quite difficult because actually people with autism often say, if I have to concentrate on that side of things, I can't process what you're trying to tell me, or I can't process what else is going on around me. So if I'm looking away and I'm focusing on something specific, it helps me listen. So I'm not having to use my visual skills quite as much to deal with that communication. So if I'm staring at the floor, or I'm looking away, or it looks as if I'm not paying attention, or even if I'm staring, it might mean that actually that helps me listen. So my advice would be, it doesn't matter. It's not important. If you're trying to talk to someone, you're trying to engage with them, maybe let that go and help with that communication. Somebody recently said to me that they spent, a lot of their social communication, their social time in the pub with their friends, they're often trying to count to make appropriate eye contact. So they might say something like, I need to look at their eyes, 1, 2, 3, and now their nose, 1, 2, 3, and now their hair, 1, 2, 3. How difficult must that be when actually what you're trying to do also at the same time as all that going on in your head is actually to be listening to something or taking information or watching the match. It shouldn't be important how somebody behaves in that manner. Sometimes people with autism will find the ebb and flow of conversation quite difficult. They might often they've said, I don't know when to come in with a comment. I can't follow the peaks and troughs of conversation. If there's a silence, do I fill it? And when there is a silence, what do I say? So our ability, if you like, to make small talk, to talk about things that really aren't of interest to most people, is quite high. So we often talk about the weather. Even if we're standing in the rain, we insist on making a comment about it. We might be commenting about things in the news. We might be commenting about what's going on around us. But that can be quite difficult. So somebody with autism, a person with autism might say, I don't know. I can't always tell what's appropriate. And sometimes in previous social experiences, I might have said the wrong thing, or I might have spent a bit of time catching up with the conversation, and when I do come in with a comment, it's already moved on. And people get annoyed, they get frustrated. So what happens? I stop talking. I start to think, I just start to watch, or maybe I don't engage socially at all. We often also say to young children or people with autism, it's really important that we tell the truth. Unfortunately, society doesn't behave like that. We bend the truth all the time. We also sometimes tell our little white lies and things like that. And if we're actually saying to somebody with autism that actually it's really important to tell the truth, then quite often they understand that, and they'll say, why is it that I'm told to tell the truth, but when I do tell the truth, I've somehow got it wrong and I'm the one to blame? And I think that's a lesson for us all to just think about. Actually, we do blur our lines about our social rules and our social cues. We need to remember that this isn't written down in any sort of book anywhere, but it's important that we look at our own behaviour and our own interpretation of things and think, actually, why is it so wrong if somebody's being very honest about something? People with autism sometimes find our tone of voice or use of tone of voice and the intonation that we use to communicate quite difficult to understand. So I'm going to give you an example now of a sentence that can be spoken in several different ways, but the meaning is completely different. I didn't say you stole my money. 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 The same sentence, 7 different ways, and all with very, very different meanings. And sometimes a person with autism will say, I didn't pick up on the inflection, on the tone of voice that the person was using, so I misunderstood the message. I got angry because I thought they were accusing me of something. I got upset because I didn't understand. They got upset because I didn't understand, or I misunderstood. The diagnosis process for autism includes sensory processing. So that's part of the autism spectrum condition. And often people with autism will say that they have a sensory processing difference or a disorder. It affects all of the senses, but it can affect them really quite differently. So for example, people often talk about a difficulty with loud noises and bright lights, but actually it's more than that. People can be very hypersensitive. So for example, they might find just the slightest noise, perhaps the hum of a fridge in the background, or a noise outside through double glazing. They might find that really quite intrusive and quite challenging to focus on anything else with those noises going on. It could be that they're extremely sensitive to taste, for example. So they might be looking at only eating quite bland foods. Often people talk about having things without any sauces, not crunchy, might be just soft foods, all of those sorts of things, because actually it's all quite overwhelming, it's hypersensitive. Equally, people can be under-responsive or hyposensitive to things. So actually they might seek out more noise, more light, more touch, because their senses are processing things in a slightly different way. What adds to the confusion is that there can be times when a person is processing quite differently. So they might be extremely sensitive at one point, they might be under-responsive at another. Each sense might process in a different way. Often people will have sensory aids or sensory toys that they use to help them manage their sensory processing. So you might see people with weighted blankets, heavy coats, they might have dark glasses on, they might have ear defenders, they might be wearing quite a heavy bag, they might have all sorts of fiddle toys that we call them, or squeeze balls or things like that. So lots of different things that can help people actually manage not just their anxiety, but their sensory processing, so their receptors, to help them deal with the world around them. So what can we all do to help? I think we need to encourage understanding, equality, and suspend any judgment. It's really important to do that. We need to offer assistance. So we need to ask people if they are disclosing that they've got a condition, and it doesn't matter whether it's autism or anything else really, if they're inviting that information to you, it's really important that you ask, how can I help? Everybody's different. Some people might not need any help, they might just want to make you aware, but it's really important to ask, is there anything I can do to help at the moment? Or, you know where I am, I'm going to be standing here during the match, or that person over there will be able to help. So thinking about how you might be able to help that individual. What might seem an insignificant point to one person should be treated with respect. So if somebody is talking to you about a point that you think, well, it really doesn't matter in the grand scheme of things, let's just ignore that or forget about it. Often people with autism have a difficulty with prioritising and understanding the different levels of importance, if you like, in a particular issue or a particular process. So they might be focusing on something that to somebody else might seem insignificant, but it's not to them. So deal with it, address it, help them work through that conversation or that question and come to a conclusion. Also, you need to address your concerns. So if you have got a concern about a particular fan or something that's happening, maybe you need to direct people to do something or not do something, then do that. But do remember that those difficulties that somebody with autism might have about picking out the information that's relevant, information that's important, and also concentrating on things while everything else is going around can be quite difficult. So if you have a concern or you need to get a message across, I think it's really important to be quite blunt. People with autism will say, you're doing me no favours by peppering your language with lots of niceties or small talk, because I can't always pick up on what's the important bit, what's the message you're trying to get across. So actually, do me a favour, tell me how it is, be blunt and be honest, and just help me work through that. Checking understanding. So for a person, again, if you're asking somebody to do something or you're agreeing a process that you're both going to work through, it might be about checking that understanding. A simple yes or no isn't always the right way to do things. You know, if you ask a question of somebody, we tend to agree and say yes most of the time. What you might need to do is something along the lines of, what do you think is going to happen next? Or can you tell me how you're going to work through that process? Who do you think you'll need to speak to work that through? Those sorts of things. Just check the understanding so that you know that that person's got the right idea. Other things that you might want to consider is the effect that change has on people. So when you're talking to your fans or when you're thinking about your grounds, it might be, obviously, there are things like you might change the kit that you're releasing each year. It might be a different fabric. It could be that you're changing your entrances. So maybe the entrance to the ground is changing, the signage is changing, the car park layout's changing, maybe the where the food is. All of those sorts of things need to be considered. It's not that you shouldn't make any changes, but certainly somebody with autism really would appreciate some forewarning and perhaps some consultation on that. So looking at how do you inform fans of any changes? How do you consult with your fans? I'm sure you have forums all the time. So how do you engage with people who might see things from a slightly different point of view? One thing that can be really useful, people with autism do see the world really quite differently, and actually that can be a massive boost. They can see things that maybe you haven't thought of, maybe you haven't seen a pitfall that actually they can see, or a way of doing things that actually is a lot more straightforward than we think. We might overcomplicate things. So do try and find out from fans and talk about changes that are going to be made and how they might affect them. In your leaflets, on your match day programs and your websites, really try and make sure that people are aware of the services you provide to help people with differences and disabilities. Do you have a quiet room where people can go during the match day if things become quite overwhelming? Do you have things on your website, so perhaps a 360-degree tour or a video, or even just a PowerPoint with some photographs of the ground, maybe of some of the staff at the ground? What does a steward look like? What does a steward wear? What does the car park look like? Are there turnstiles or areas where people can go where they don't have to go through the main queue and the main turnstiles? So all of those things can be really useful. If somebody can look at that before match day and get a real understanding, it can really help. One thing I haven't mentioned is that you also might have people with autism who work at the ground. There will be colleagues, there will be people there, your volunteers, who might also have a diagnosis. So it's really important to remember that all of these points can apply to people working at the ground as well. And certainly with your awareness, it might be excuse me, looking at how you train your staff, train your managers to understand your employees who might disclose that they've got a diagnosis. Set an example for you to be consistent, to be appropriate in your behaviour, to make sure that staff are trained, that staff understand as much as they can, not just about autism, but their fans in general, and what makes their experience as positive as they possibly can. People with autism want that social experience. There's no reason why they can't come to events and they can't be a really good part of your community. And by making some of these adjustments, just being a little bit more aware about autism and some of the things that people might find quite challenging, then I'm sure their experience will be far more positive and you'll have some more fans.